All right, in this lab lesson, we're going to look at arteries first and then veins. I want to point out that your textbook has some excellent blood flow diagrams. One of the main ways you're going to be assessed in this lab unit will be on the flow of blood in the body, rather than just having you label diagrams of blood vessels. You'll also be asked to describe the flow of blood through the body. So for example, if I were to ask you, tell me the sequence in which blood flows from the heart to, say, the spleen, you could look at this diagram on the left, and you would say, okay, well, first I'd start in the aorta, specifically ascending aorta, aortic arch, not shown in this diagram. But then you would be in the thoracic aorta, and then the abdominal aorta, and then you would be in the celiac trunk, and then you would be in the splenic artery, which leads to the spleen. So these diagrams can be very helpful when you're working on tracing problems. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to start with arteries, and specifically we're going to look at arteries of the upper body in this video. Before I do that, I want to just remind you what an artery is. It's any vessel that carries blood away from the heart. As arteries branch and get farther away from the heart, they get smaller and smaller. And at each branch event, the names of the arteries change. Kind of like when you have a change in the name of a road as branches come off that road, or as the road bends, something like that. All right, so the logical way to teach the arteries would be to start at the heart and work our way out, because again, we're following the path of blood flow. So let's look at the arteries of the upper body. Here we've got a heart. Let me get my pointer. Here we've got the heart, and here's the aorta. And the very first part of the aorta is called the ascending aorta. So any artery tracing problem you do, your first step is going to be ascending aorta, and then aortic arch. And then the aorta goes down behind the heart. That's called the descending aorta. You can see that here on the right-hand diagram, descending aorta, which is also called the thoracic aorta. And the aorta actually extends all the way down through the body trunk. Once you go past the diaphragm, it's no longer called the thoracic aorta, it's called the abdominal aorta, as is indicated here. All right, next on your list is the brachiocephalic artery. So we're going to look at the aortic arch, and there are three major branches that come off the aortic arch. The first of the three branches, and by first I mean with respect to blood flow, the first of the three branches is the brachiocephalic artery. That translates to arm head, brachioceph, arm head. So obviously it leads to the arm and the head. This artery is not a paired artery. It's only found on the right side of the human arterial system. So it only leads to the right side of the head and to the right upper limb, the right arm. Next on your list are the subclavian veins. So the subclavian, one of them branches off the brachiocephalic artery. So the right subclavian artery comes off the brachiocephalic artery. And subclavian implies that it is located below the clavicle, which it is. The left subclavian artery comes directly off the aortic arch. It's the third branch off the aortic arch, so left subclavian artery. Finally, on at least this slide anyways, are the common carotids. You've got a pair of common carotids. The right common carotid branches off the brachiocephalic artery, and the common carotid leads up to the head. And then the left common carotid branches directly off the aortic arch. It's the second branch off the aortic arch, and it also leads up to the head. All right, so let's visualize blood leaving the body and going to the head. Let's say that blood is going to the right side of the head. It would go up the ascending aorta to the aortic arch, up the brachiocephalic artery, and then up the right common carotid to get towards the head. Now, if blood was going to flow to the left side of the head, we would start again back at the heart, up the ascending aorta, aortic arch, and we would take the second branch off the aortic arch, which is the left common carotid, which would get us up to the head. All right, following the common carotid up, so right here, this is a lateral view. This would be the common carotid. In this case, we're looking at the right common carotid. And this is true for both of the common carotids, both of them branch to form an external carotid and an internal carotid. The external carotid, as the name implies, will go to the outside of the skull, and it will feed things like your scalp and areas such as the flesh of your face, areas outside the skull. The internal carotid goes deep to the skull, and it is one of the primary sources of blood for the brain. Now, the brain is a total blood hog, so there's another set of arteries that feed the brain, aside from the internal carotids, and those are called the vertebral arteries, or vertebral arteries. And they actually come right off the subclavian, directly off the subclavian on both the right and the left side, and they go up through some foramina in the cervical vertebrae, called transverse foramina, and those vertebral arteries also feed blood to the brain. So you'll note that there's multiple pathways to the brain, which is good because if one pathway is blocked, you still have some other pathways to get that precious blood to your brain. All right, let's look at the upper limbs now. So if we're going to the right limb, we would go up the ascending aorta, up the brachiocephalic artery, then we would be in the subclavian artery on the right side, and then we would be in what's called the axillary artery. Axillary means armpit. And then from the axillary artery, we would go into what's called the brachial artery, which is the primary artery feeding blood to the arm. For the purposes of your lab, we're stopping basically at the elbow, so you don't have to know any of the vascular tissue in the forearms or hands. Now, what if we were sending blood to the left arm? We'd start at the ascending aorta to the aortic arch, and we would take the third branch off of the aortic arch, which is the left subclavian artery, and then we would be in the axillary artery, and then we would be in the brachial artery. Just to review, there's some other important arteries in the upper body associated with the heart. You already learned these with your heart lab. This would be the pulmonary trunk, just as a reminder. And the pulmonary trunk is a unique artery because it carries deoxygenated blood. And the pulmonary trunk, as its name implies, it branches to the left and right pulmonary arteries leading to the lungs.